We're not only interested in extracting resources. We want to partner with you to create local value chains, to create good jobs here in Africa. We want to share European technology with you. We want to invest in skills for local workers. This is crucial for the young people, because the stronger you are as suppliers, the more Europe will diversify supply chains towards Africa, and the more we both will de-risk our economies. It's a clear win-win. The benefits of expanding Africa's clean energy sector would be massive. By speeding up the transition to solar and wind power, energy sector jobs in Africa could double in a few years. And Africa could produce enough clean energy not only to power up your continent, but also to export abroad. Climate action can be one of the main drivers of Africa's growth. But for this, Africa needs massive investment. And Europe wants to be your partner, in closing this investment gap.
L'Afrique est mon continent et ma maison.
Africa is my continent and my home. These were the words recently proclaimed by French President Emmanuel Macron, sparking waves of anger, frustration, and disbelief across Africa and among its allies worldwide. But what did he mean by this? Is it a claim of endearment, or a stark reminder that France may still view Africa?
The Parisian air was tense, thick with the weight of unspoken fears, in the ornate halls of the palace. France's highest officials sat in silence, staring at a dossier that felt like a verdict. The report was blunt, clinical, and devastating. Uranium supplies from Niger, Mali, and Burkina Faso were suspended indefinitely. Contracts once renewed with a handshake and a promise of mutual benefit were now void. The mines that had powered France's glittering cities, its nuclear plants, its claim to energy independence, had gone dark. Outside, the world still believed France stood strong. The lights of Paris sparkled against the Seine, the tricolor flags fluttered proudly above government buildings, and the television anchors spoke of resilience and unity. But behind closed doors, the truth was leaking like sand through a broken hourglass. Without uranium from the Sahel, France's illusion of energy sovereignty was crumbling. In the deserts of West Africa, where the sun burned fierce and unrelenting, a quiet revolution was unfolding. The nations once dismissed as France's former colonies had discovered the power of leverage, and they were wielding it with precision. Burkina Faso, Niger, and Mali, three nations long underestimated, had realized that beneath their arid soil lay not just mineral wealth, but political power. Uranium, the invisible heart of France's nuclear empire, was no longer flowing freely to the metropole. For decades, French companies had extracted uranium from African soil with minimal returns to the host nations. Contracts were written in Paris, profits stayed in Europe, and the Sahel remained poor. The uranium that lit up Lyon, Marseille, and Bordeaux left behind darkness in Niamey and Bamako. Generations grew up watching foreign trucks roll out of the mines while their own towns stayed without electricity. The resentment festered, silent but growing, waiting for a moment to erupt. That moment had arrived. It began quietly, with whispers among leaders who had grown weary of being patronized. They saw a new world forming. Around them, China building roads and ports, Russia offering security assistance, and Western influence slipping away like a receding tide. For the first time, they asked themselves, why should Africa's resources continue to feed a Europe that had given little but lectures in return? When Niger's government announced the suspension of uranium exports, Paris dismissed it as political posturing. But when Burkina Faso and Mali joined in solidarity, refusing to renew their supply contracts, the FOD cracked. French energy executives called emergency meetings. The stock market quivered, and in Washington, policymakers began to whisper the words no one had dared to utter aloud. What if Africa no longer needed the West? The French media tried to frame it as a misunderstanding, a temporary negotiation glitch. Yet the truth was more profound. The Sahelian nations were no longer bargaining for slightly better terms. They were redefining the relationship altogether. They demanded not aid but equity, not partnership in words but partnership in power. They wanted to process uranium on their own soil, to sell it on their own terms, to dictate who benefited and who waited. France's diplomats rushed to the region, armed with promises, investments, and veiled threats. They found leaders unmoved. In Ouagadougou, Burkina Faso's capital, the president told the French envoy plainly, "You had your century. This one belongs to us." In Niamey, Niger's Minister of Mines held up a photo of a French nuclear plant and said, "You built this with our sweat. Now we will build our own." In Bamako, Mali's corridors of power buzzed with excitement. Young economists and engineers gathered in conference rooms, drafting plans for regional cooperation on uranium processing. For once, the narrative wasn't about dependence but defiance. The Sahelist leaders knew that France's entire nuclear infrastructure depended on the ore beneath their deserts. Without it, France would face rolling blackouts, industrial slowdowns, and public outrage. And that knowledge was intoxicating. Across Europe, panic spread quietly through boardrooms and energy ministries. The question was whispered in meetings across Brussels and Berlin: what happens if Africa refuses to play by the old rules? For decades, Europe had built its comfort on cheap resources and compliant governments. Now the script was flipping. France's vulnerability became a symbol of Western decline, and Africa's uranium, once an afterthought, became the fulcrum of global power. The West tried to rally. American analysts proposed emergency measures. Perhaps the U.S. could mediate or offer alternative trade incentives. But Africa was no longer listening. The Sahelian governments had found new friends. China, sensing opportunity, offered financing for local enrichment facilities. Russia extended technical expertise and military guarantees. For the first time, the power dynamic was inverted. It was France that came begging, and Africa that set the price. The French president's plea, $100 billion for renewed uranium access, was historic not for its generosity, but for its desperation. Never before had France openly admitted such dependency. The offer was meant to soothe, to rebuild bridges, to remind the Sahel of shared history. But the words rang hollow. In the eyes of Africa's new generation, shared history was a euphemism for exploitation. As France's offer made headlines, protests erupted in West African capitals. Demonstrators waved signs that read, "Our uranium, our future, and no more colonial deals." The French media tried to dismiss the movements as orchestrated by foreign rivals, but the passion on the streets told a different story. This was not about geopolitics. It was about dignity. In the rural towns where miners lived and worked, hope flickered for the first time in decades. The men who had descended daily into radioactive dust could now imagine a future where their labor powered their own nation, not someone else's. The elders spoke of ancestors who had resisted colonial domination. The youth saw themselves as the continuation of that struggle, armed not with weapons, but with the wealth of their own soil. France, once the master storyteller of Africa's destiny, now found itself struggling to control the narrative. Every attempt at diplomacy came off as arrogance. Every statement of goodwill was met with suspicion. Western media outlets began publishing alarmist pieces about Africa's drift toward authoritarian partners, conveniently ignoring the centuries of European dominance that had sparked this revolt in the first place. The irony was painful. The same West that had praised free markets was now furious that Africa was exercising freedom of choice. The same powers that had spoken of sovereignty were now condemning it when it no longer served their interests. The hypocrisy was laid bare, and the world was watching. Inside France, ordinary citizens were beginning to feel the consequences. Energy prices climbed. The promise of affordable, clean nuclear energy, once France's badge of pride, began to fade. Public trust in government eroded as news leaked that the country's energy grid was dangerously dependent on African uranium. Politicians pointed fingers. Opposition leaders accused the administration of losing control. Beneath the surface, fear simmered, fear not just of blackouts, but of decline. Across the Atlantic, American officials watched uneasily. The U.S. had its own interests in African minerals, cobalt, lithium, gold, and worried that the sales defiance could spark a continental awakening. If Burkina Faso, Niger, and Mali could stand up to France, what stopped Congo or Zambia from doing the same to other Western powers? The shift was ideological as much as economic. The Global South was discovering its collective voice. Meanwhile, in Africa, momentum was building. The three nations began formal talks to establish a joint uranium authority, an institution that would coordinate mining, pricing, and exports. Economists compared it to OPEC, but for uranium. The idea was simple yet revolutionary. Africa would no longer export raw materials for pennies. It would export power, influence, and independence. The symbolism was potent. In one generation, Africa had gone from supplier to strategist. France's old colonial playbook was obsolete. The sales leaders spoke not as subordinates, but as equals on the world stage, and in their eyes gleamed the quiet satisfaction of a people reclaiming what was always theirs. The world media struggled to keep up. Headlines framed the crisis as an energy shock, but it was more than that. It was a moral reckoning, a reversal of centuries of extraction and submission. The old order where Europe exploited and Africa endured was cracking. In Paris, the realization was devastating. The president met with his energy advisors in a closed session that stretched late into the night. Voices were raised. Some argued for aggressive diplomacy, others for quiet concessions. But all knew the same truth. France no longer held the cards. The age of unilateral control was over, and deep in the deserts of the Sahel, under the relentless sun, the miners continued their work. This time, though, it felt different. The trucks that rumbled out of the uranium fields carried not just ore, but pride. Each shipment symbolized a choice that Africa would no longer be the background to someone else's story, but the author of its own. In the silence that followed, France's leaders finally understood what they had lost. It was not just uranium. It was the illusion of supremacy. The Sahel had rewritten the script, and in the process, it had shaken the foundation of Western confidence. The day France's energy minister landed in Niamey, the air was heavy with dust and defiance. The Sahel sun glared mercilessly over the tarmac as the minister stepped off the jet, her face hidden behind designer sunglasses that couldn't conceal the tremor in her voice when she greeted Niger's delegation. The French tricolor fluttered. Alongside the Nigerian flag, a relic of diplomatic courtesy masking a relationship that had soured beyond repair, behind the smiles and handshakes lay silent warfare. Paris had come to negotiate. Niamey had come to make history. The French minister began with charm, reminding her hosts of shared struggles, shared progress, shared futures. Her words were polished, rehearsed, coated with nostalgia for a colonial past dressed up as partnership. But the Nigerian officials were unmoved. They listened politely, their expressions still as stone. The lead negotiator finally spoke, his tone calm but firm. "Madame Minister," he said, "for 60 years we have heard of shared futures. Yet only one side has lived it." The words hung in the air like dust. The French delegation shifted uncomfortably. The conversation turned two figures: investments, royalties, guarantees. France offered what it called an unprecedented package: infrastructure projects, new mining safety standards, educational programs for local engineers. But underneath every offer lay the same assumption that uranium would continue flowing to France. The Nigerian negotiator leaned forward. "You misunderstand," he said. "We are not refusing trade. We are redefining it. Uranium is not a favor. It is power, and power must now serve those who hold it." By evening, the meeting had collapsed. The French entourage returned to their hotel surrounded by whispers and cameras. Reporters sensed the failure and began spinning stories of diplomatic impasse. In Paris, the headlines tried to downplay it, calling the talks constructive. But the truth had already leaked across Africa's digital networks. France had begged, and the Sahel had said no. In Bamako, Ouagadougou, and Niamey, people flooded the streets, chanting slogans of liberation. The news spread like wildfire. Africa was standing tall. Crowds waved flags and danced in the heat, their laughter ringing through the night. They had seen their leaders reject the same power that once dictated their every move. It was more than a policy shift. It was a psychological revolution. Meanwhile, in Paris, the walls were closing in. The Energy Ministry issued a quiet alert to the uranium reserves were depleting faster than expected. Executives from France's nuclear power company warned of long-term instability. One of them dared to speak the unthinkable. Without a resolution, France's reactors might begin scaling down operations within months. The president listened in silence, his hand pressed against his temple. Around him, aides argued about solutions. Some demanded pressure, economic sanctions, suspension of aid, the language of coercion that had once worked so well. Others urged caution, warning that threats would only drive the Sahel further into the arms of Russia and China. In truth, it was already too late. Russian envoys had been quietly moving through the region for months, offering security training, weapons, and promises of non-interference. China had stepped in with proposals for joint ventures in uranium processing, pledging to build entire industrial zones powered by renewable energy. In contrast, France's proposals looked outdated, timid, and insincere. In Beijing, strategists studied satellite images of the Sahels mineral belt with interest. They saw what Paris had seen a century ago: and rich beyond measure, yet neglected. But unlike France, China did not come with memories of conquest. It came with bulldozers, engineers, and checkbooks. The Sahels leaders played their hand with the skill of poker masters. They entertained both sides, knowing that for the first time, the power of choice was theirs. A Malian advisor described it simply: "We are the new middlemen of the global energy order. Let them compete for us." The phrase spread through Western think tanks like a spark through dry grass. Analysts began issuing dire reports about strategic losses and shifting global centers of influence. Some even warned of an African pivot, a world where resource flows no longer bent automatically toward the West. In Washington, officials called emergency meetings, but even the Americans were hesitant to challenge what had become a symbol of African pride. In Africa, the tone was jubilant yet disciplined. The Sahelian governments established a joint resource council, an informal alliance of ministers and economic advisors tasked with coordinating policy. Though no official name was announced, the media dubbed it the Uranium Brotherhood. For once, the term brotherhood meant more than rhetoric. Underneath the unity, however, tension brewed. The West was not idle. Intelligence reports hinted at covert interference disinformation campaigns, attempts to sow distrust among the alliance members. Old colonial tactics re-emerged under new disguises. Anonymous sources whispered that certain factions were being bribed to break ranks. But this time, the Sahel was ready. Security was tightened around uranium facilities. Military patrols watched the mines day and night. In Burkina Faso, armed guards escorted shipments to processing depots, while in Niger, the government publicly exposed an alleged plot to sabotage key infrastructure. The message was unmistakable. Africa would not be intimidated again. The panic in the West deepened as the crisis dragged on. Energy analysts across Europe began to warn of cascading effects. Without the sale's uranium, France might be forced to buy from less stable suppliers, paying higher prices, passing the cost to consumers. The French public, already restless, started asking questions. Why had a nation that prided itself on energy independence tied its fate so closely to countries it barely respected? Across the Atlantic, American commentators took to television screens, declaring that France had been outplayed. Some mocked, others sympathized, but beneath the laughter was unease. The U.S. itself relied heavily on foreign resources, and if Africa could bring France to its knees, what stopped it from rewriting the global script? Altogether, the ripple effect was spreading. In other parts of Africa, leaders took note. From Congo's cobalt to Zambia's copper, a quiet awakening was unfolding. If the Sahel could dictate terms to France, then the age of one-sided deals was over. In Ouagadougou, a conference of African economists gathered to discuss the future of resource nationalism. One young scholar stood up and declared, "We are not anti-West. We are pro-dignity." The room erupted in applause. Across the continent, that phrase became a rallying cry. France's desperation turned to frustration. The president made a televised appeal, promising a new era of partnership. His speech was elegant, full of emotion, but to African ears it sounded hollow. The world had moved beyond the old vocabulary. Partnership could no longer mean subservience. Cooperation could no longer mean control. The most telling moment came when the Sahelian alliance announced its intent to price uranium contracts in local currencies. A symbolic gesture, but one that sent shockwaves through financial markets. The idea of decoupling from the dollar and the euro was both revolutionary and deeply threatening to the West. If Africa succeeded, it could inspire others to follow. Meanwhile, on the ground in Africa, transformation was tangible. Roads were being built around mining zones, funded not by Western aid but by new partners eager to prove their reliability. Local universities expanded programs in engineering and geology. For the first time, scholarships were offered not to study in Paris but in Accra, Nairobi, and Addis Ababa. A cultural and intellectual independence was taking root alongside economic sovereignty. At night, in the dusty towns where miners once labored in silence, radios buzzed with debate and laughter. Old men remembered the days when foreign soldiers guarded the mines. Now they watched their own sons and daughters manage them. The air was filled with pride, with a sense of long overdue balance. In Paris, however, the glow of street lamps masked a spreading dread. France's global influence, once the envy of Europe, was eroding. The uranium crisis had become more than an energy issue, it was a mirror, reflecting the decline of an empire, and the reflection was unforgiving. Behind closed doors, the French president met with his intelligence chief. They spoke in hushed tones about the possibility of sabotage, about pressure points that might fracture the Sahelian alliance. But even as they plotted, they knew the old tools were losing their edge. Military intervention was unthinkable, the political cost too high, the regional backlash too fierce. What France feared most was not the loss of uranium, but the loss of control. The realization that Africa no longer needed validation from Paris was the deepest wound of all. In Niamey, a journalist summed it up best during a live broadcast. Standing outside a government building lit by solar lamps, he smiled into the camera and said, "For the first time, we are not negotiating from weakness. France must now negotiate from need. That is history reversing itself." The words echoed far beyond the Sahel, across the world. Those watching understood what they were witnessing. A shift not just in economics, but in consciousness. The West, long accustomed to dictating the terms of global exchange, now stood before Africa as a petitioner. And in that moment, as the wind swept over the endless dunes of the Sahara, it felt as though the ghosts of generations past, those who had labored, resisted, and hoped, were finally watching justice unfold.